the Conservative government over the next few weeks will send out a propaganda leaflet to 27 million households at a cost to the British taxpayers of over £9 million in an attempt to convince the electorate to vote to remain in the European Union. That this video attempts to fact check whether the claims stand up to close scrutiny or not. The first claim concerns itself with the so-called special deal that David Cameron secured in February, which in reality were very mild watered down measures to begin with, as I covered at the time in this video, in which I explained that the so-called deal fails on virtually every point, and worse still is that the deal is not even binding on member states, as there will be no treaty change, which means no matter what the member states have been stating before the EU referendum, afterwards they are free to change any point of the deal, which effectively makes it worthless, a smoke and mirrors exercise. A stronger economy paints a picture of 4 million UK jobs reliant on the EU, which, even if true, has a gaping omission, which is that Britain has an annual trade deficit with Europe of over £90 billion per year. What does this mean? It means that Britain employs a net several millions more German, French and other EU workers at an annual cost of £90 billion a year. So the truth is that the European Union would bend over backwards to retain this net annual job subsidy from Britain that supports so many millions of European Union jobs. For if there were a trade balance between Britain and Europe rather than the current imbalance, then that 90 billion would create and sustain 3 million new UK jobs if Britain stopped paying for EU jobs, effectively bringing home jobs from Europe. Whilst improving our lives concerns itself with the fact that the British pound could fall if the UK left the EU, this appears completely blind to the ongoing currency war that has virtually every major nation trying to competitively devalue their currencies against one another, that has seen a series of central banks this year, such as those of Japan and Europe, cut their interest rates to below zero, negative interest rates, in an attempt to get their currencies to fall. So falling the British pound in reality would amount to Britain winning a currency war battle, all without doing anything. And secondly, actual probability would favour the British pound rising post-Brexit, because the market would conclude that the huge trade imbalance with Europe would likely shrink. Whilst the statements on travel mainly concerns itself with tourism, as though anything would really change. After all, Britons can relatively easily travel to virtually any civilised nation on the planet, and so it will remain for Britons travelling to the EU, also ignoring the consequences of out of control immigration, one of 5 million low paid Eastern Europeans flooding into Britain and driving down wages for everyone. Economic migrant workers supported by the taxpayer through in-work benefits such as tax credits, and in the process creating a crisis in housing, schooling and in fact every state service, all ignored by the propaganda leaflet. And that is before one considers the migration crisis Europe is facing due to its weak southern borders. What happens if we leave the EU is a pure play on fear of effectively Britain being cast adrift in the Atlantic Ocean for a decade, diminished trade and influence. Again, this misses the point that the European Union is on an unsustainable trend trajectory, one of forces that will rip it apart, forces such as the bankrupt southern states requiring bailout after bailout after bailouts. The disparity between the Western and Eastern civilizations of Europe, as illustrated by the emerging extremist governments of the likes of Poland and Hungary, clamping down on free speech and freedom, whilst at the same time the EU is trying to incorporate the likes of the Ukrainian civil war into its borders. Instead, the fundamental truth is that the European Union has a destiny with disintegration, and so it would be far better for Britain to leave sooner rather than later to better limit the damage from a disintegrating European Union. Controlling immigration and securing our borders. Well, this section is pure fantasy. Those who wrote it must be living on another planet, for everyone understands that Britain has no real control over its borders. For we can see the consequences of out of control immigration with our very own eyes. The latest immigration statistics paint a bleak picture of not just continuing out of control immigration, but a worsening trend where annual net migration has risen from 100,000 a year to 200,000 to 300,000, and it now stands at 340,000 a year and is on a trend trajectory towards net migration of 500,000 a year before the end of this decade. And where security is concerned, well, Paris and Brussels attack don't paint a reliable picture for a secure European Union. Instead, the realities of a very weak and porous southern borders. Whereas the page on the benefits of EU membership is basically a summary of what the leaflet's previous pages contained, whilst lavishing praise on the EU, forgets to mention that the EU cost the UK a net £175 million per week. And lastly, we are reminded that the 23rd of June referendum is a once in a generation decision, which is true because with each passing year the price for leaving the EU will just keep increasing. So whilst the Brexit today could cost Britain between 2% and 5% of GDP, however, letting things roll on for another decade and we will likely pass the point of no return where the cost of Brexit will be too painful, and so Britain would be permanently locked into a death embrace with a European Union that has a destiny with disintegration.